So good morning and welcome to the Conservation Day seminar programme. It falls into three parts and I'm just chairing the first part through till 11:30. My name's Tim Yates. I work for Building Research Establishment, BRE, and I've focused on stone for more than 30 years now, mostly to do with testing and European standards, and I had the delight of going to a European standards meeting yesterday, but it was in Alicante, so it was not too hard and warmer than it was here. But it's good to be with you this morning. We've got three speakers for our morning session. We've actually got four speakers, three sessions, and each one will be 30 minutes. They'll speak for 20 minutes, maybe just a little bit more. Then we'll have time for some questions, and then we'll move on to the next one. The theme for this first session is very much about if you want to choose a stone for restoration and conservation work, what information do you need? What information is out there? Where can you find help and where can you find guidance to make the correct decision for your project? So bear that in mind as we go through the presentations. We start with Clara Willett from Historic England. Clara, she's 30 years of experience in architectural conservation, first in private practice, then with Historic England, which was English Heritage. Clara and I met, 20 years ago or more on the stone database, which she'll speak about. As a building conservation advisor, she leads on masonry conservation advice and research, contributes to guidance and training on the same topics. She managed the national training scheme, providing job training for in-traditional skills, and she managed this strategic stone study project to complete the Building Stones database, which is very much her focus today. Also a member of the Church's Building Council on Sculpture and Furnishings Committee and the Stone Federation Heritage Stone Group. So she's going to speak about the stone database for England, which brings together data on indigenous stones which have been used to construct our built heritage. Clara, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Oh, hello. It's lovely to see so many of you here today. So welcome, and we're delighted to be here. So thank you for that introduction, Tim. As you said, I'm going to be talking about the Building Stone database for England. And that's a project that we've been working on for some time. So without further ado, I'll move on. So as you can see, we've got a huge range of built structures in our country. And did you know that almost half of England's listed buildings and structures listed with stone? There's 49% of our listed buildings have stone in them, so it's a huge number. And if you want another massive number, that's 187,500 buildings, listed buildings, have stone in them. So that's a huge number, and that's just listed buildings. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today isn't about listed buildings, it's about our historic heritage. That's unlisted buildings, that's buildings you walk past every day. So listed or not listed, stone buildings are an important part of our heritage. And also, if you can see these pictures here, the variety of stone that we have in our country, the regional and the vernacular, is so varied. And so we are blessed, if you like, with such a brilliant range of our underlying geology and our indigenous stones. So we know that there's a lot of information. We do know about our building stones. We've got a wealth of information. So from the British Geological Memoirs, the wonderful books by Alec Clifton Taylor, we know there's a lot of information out there. And of course, we've got the likes of Nicholas Pevsner's regional guides. There's a whole range of information about building stone and building materials in general. But actually, what do we know about building stone? And where can we find this information easily? So that's where the Building Stone database comes in. And that brings together a huge amount of information in one place online. And it talks about the sources and it talks about the vernacular. So I'll keep saying to you, we're not here to talk about listed buildings. We're talking about vernacular stone buildings. And so what I want you to take away from my talk is really that this information is available online, it's free, and it's accessible to everybody. And it's a new resource, and we want people to use it and let us know how you're using it and how we can make it even better for you. So that's what I want you to take away from this is a fantastic resource, and we want you to explore it. So I'll give you a little bit of a background to the project. So you'll hear me talk about the Building Stone Database for England. That is the online resource. But some of you who've been around, like some of us here for a long time, will have heard about the Strategic Stone Study. So that was a project which brought basically all this information together. So the background to this really was back in 2004, and the then Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, which is now the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So they commissioned a report planning for the supply of natural stone and roofing stone in England and Wales, otherwise known as the Simmons Report. And this report examined the issues affecting the supply and demand of indigenous building stone in the UK. And it focused on sourcing, the problems of sourcing appropriate stone to repair historic buildings. But one of its recommendations was that it should be a national database should be created, but also that mineral planning authorities should identify and safeguard heritage quarries. And that's something else you'll be hearing about in this session as well. So the Building Stone Database for England project was commissioned in response to these recommendations. So its purpose was to provide a clearer indication of the distribution and the relationship between stone-built structures and their former or currently worked building stone quarries in England. So you can see the front cover. If you can get a hold of a copy of this report, good luck. It's a great, great publication, but it's only in printed format that I've found. But it's a great publication. So beginning in 2007, the project kicked off and it received initial funding from the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister and was managed by then English Heritage. We are now Historic England. So funding was made available, and Historic England has worked with the British Geological Survey, volunteer geologists and professional geological consultants to undertake this sort of mighty study. And these people did the research and the field work that brought all this information together. So 2007 is a long time ago now, and here we are in 2014. So it has taken a long time. It hasn't been going all that time. It's been as and when funding's been available. But it's been a huge, huge undertaking with lots of brilliant people involved. So it's a real collaborative project. And as I said, the database is primarily aimed at mineral planners. That was the initial aim of this project. So when you start looking at it, it's very much has been organised directing at mineral planning authorities. But what we found as the project's moved on, that it's become a much broader audience has been really interested in the information in this database. So I'll tell you about the various resources that are available that makes it accessible for lots and lots of different people. So this just gives you a little screenshot of the database. And what you can see here is a GIS, a Geographical Information System map, a map explorer. And what you can see on here, obviously, we're only looking at England. I apologise. Historic Scotland has a fabulous one for Scotland as well, a database, so I must plug that as well. But obviously we're looking at England here, and what you'll see is lots and lots of blue squares, and they're the sources. And then somewhere in there, yes, you'll see some little green dots. They're the structures. So at the moment, it just looks covered. But obviously what you can do is interrogate this. So but what you can see here, which is really exciting, is the spatial relationship between these structures and their sources. So it's really helping us understand the occurrence and the historic use and the availability of building stones in England. So this really is giving us a better, clearer understanding of this relationship. So it's really going to help us identify and source suitable stone for the repair of historic buildings, as well as identifying areas where local sources and local stones are no longer one, but extraction could be made possible again. And this also, it demonstrates patterns of stones used for the vernacular architecture. And we can begin to really recognize the vernacular styles and the building materials that are used. So what we want is for the local authority, planning authorities, to look at this, and it's going to encourage them to do more safeguarding and encourage the use of indigenous stones, not only for conservation work, but also for new build in sensitive conservation areas. So I'm going to give you some more figures, which I think is pretty exciting and impressive. So this database, now it's finally complete, has got over 4,000 building stones, 15,500 building sources, and 20,000 representative historic structures, stone structures. So once we start to see the volume and the importance of stone in our country, we can really relate to that. So what we feel is this is really bringing us to understand and support sustainable sourcing of building stones for the repair of historic buildings, but also for new build. So this is again the Map Explorer, and what you can do, it's an interactive and searchable web-based geographical information. So we can, all your chairs is a postcard, and there's a link there directly to the database, so you can go and play with it. It's based on Esri software. So some of you may have used the previous database, which was cutting edge in 2007, 2008. But obviously, you know, IT software has moved on. So now we have Esri software to support this. So here you can search for specific structures, places, and potential sources of stones used. So, for example, you can search for quarries and building stones in a specific area. So you can search using for a place, you can put in a postcode, a building, or a quarry. But also you can look at the underlying geology as well. So that's brilliant. It's a brilliant resource. It does have limitations. Not every stone building that I've mentioned, so not those 187,500 buildings are in the database. We've got 20,000, they're representative. These are historic sources of stone, so it's not an updated list of quarries. So you won't go there, you'll see it'll say it's a current quarry. That's not your answer. You need to go and check that out for yourselves and see whether that stone is still available, that quarry is still operating. And there is the directory of mines and quarries, which will give you that information as well. So it does have some limitations. It's a point-in-time data. We'd love to be able to update it, but as you can see, it's taken us a really long time to collate all this information. So it would be like the Forth Bridge. So we've painted the Forth Bridge. It's looking great at the moment. Let's make use of it as best we can at the moment. So that's the GIS. That's something for you to play with, have fun with, interrogate it, find out what you can. We encourage you to, and we're going to be encouraging you to give us feedback as well. Also, what we're really pleased about is we've finally been able to create a whole set of guides that cover the whole of England. So we're really proud that at the end, literally last week, we uploaded 45 guides that cover England. So there you can see the lovely front covers of all of them. And these are roughly county-based. It's complicated in terms of we're trying to encompass mineral planning authorities as well. So that's why they're not sort of necessarily all just counties. But if you're looking for a particular county, you will find it there in your search. So I hope you can see the range of not only buildings, but also the vernacular style and the variety we have in this country. So some of you will be familiar with some of the previous atlases. What we've done is we have revised them. We've made them more accessible. And that means that these were written by brilliant geologists, brilliant historic buildings experts. But we're not all geologists. So what we've tried to do is make it accessible for non-geologists. So I hope you'll find it really accessible. What we're also doing is we've created further reading. There's lots of reference material for you to go and inquire more. We've got a further reading guide, which again is all about geological references, historic building references. So there's that for you to explore as well. We're also just about to upload a glossary of terms. Again, for non-geologists, there's lots of fascinating geological terms, but lots of them have left me wondering. So we've created a glossary. So it's all about making it accessible for people. So just to show you a little bit inside some of these guides, in order to make it more accessible, we've created stratigraphic tables. So they will take you through all the building stones. And each of the guides have a bedrock or a drift geology map, so you can actually see in that area what the geology is. And these have been, the maps are created by our good friends at the British Geological Survey, who've done fantastic work over this project. And the stratigraphic table, as I said, will help guide you through and it'll map you through. Some of the guides have imported stone sections. So what we're talking about here is indigenous building materials, local materials. But obviously, as we know, as transportation improved, stones get moved around, stones get imported. But within the context of the Building Stone database, imported stones means outside of the county. So some of our guides have got information about imported stones as well. They're highly illustrated. So again, we wanted people to really get excited about our stone heritage. And I hope you'll come and have a look at some of the examples we've got. I hope you'll download them and really enjoy the beauty of our stone-built heritage. They go through chronologically, so from the oldest stones through to the younger stones. So you'll be walked through and you'll be much wiser about geology, which is what we want. We also have, for those of you who like Excel spreadsheets, I quite like them myself, the data is put into spreadsheets. So each county, each area guide also has companion spreadsheets, and the database information is put into those. So each area has 3 spreadsheets, and they cover the building stones, and there's more information there about each individual building stone. There's a spreadsheet about the sources, so you can search for the sources of a particular building stone in that area. And also there's a list of all the structures as well. So it's basically, the data is there for you to interrogate and download for that particular area. So again, it's just repackaging the different forms of this database. That's what you'll see when you go to the Historic England website, which is where all this information is. We're at stand D56. We'd be delighted to see as many of you as possible. Come and talk to us, come and see some of the guides, come and have a look. We're demonstrating the GIS there as well for you. We're also doing part of our Technical Tuesday webinars. Historic England runs roughly every month, and they are free 1-hour webinars on a range of topics. But next week, we're talking again about the Building Stone database. I would encourage you to have a look at our Technical Tuesday webinars because they're all recorded and you can while away your hours on a variety of fascinating topics. So I'd invite you to have a look at those as well. So what I hope I've shown you today has filled you with some enthusiasm to go and have a look and have a play. And please feedback to us. My name is on the website, so you can email me and let me know what you think of it, and I will respond. But that's lovely. But thank you very much for your time and your interest. And please go and have a look at the database. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Clara. it's come a very long way since we sat in a pub in Shrewsbury some 20 years ago and talked about white sandstones, and this is an idea. And I do encourage you to have a look. The guides particularly are brilliant, and although I worked in sorting stones for 35 years, I downloaded lots of them.
Hey, brilliant.
They're really good. They're a really good reference. But any plans for the future for the database?
Well, as I said, we've just completed it, and it is a point in time data. So we've got no plans to update it at the moment. And we know it's not perfect, but that's why we want feedback from people. So I think the aspiration would be that we could update it in the future. There is more work to do with mineral planners to get this information out to people as well, and really to advocate for getting the right stones for repair and for new build as well. So yeah, we've always got plans.
Any questions from people here? I can see one on that side.
Hello, Clara. You probably. I was just wondering, your historic England. Do you have any connections with Cardew and the Welsh Assembly? I've got a Welsh quarry, and the Welsh Assembly state that I export 50% of everything I do to a foreign country called England. So would I be acceptable to go into your imported section?
Would you? Oh, I suspect you probably are in our imported section already. And if you're not, then we need to be talking about it, because obviously imported stones is a very big part of our heritage, so we can't ignore it. So the answer probably is yes. The question you asked about Cadw is yes, we're always collaborating with Cadw, with Historic Environment Scotland. As I mentioned, Historic Environment Scotland have got a brilliant building stone database of their own as well. I know there is a willingness from Wales to have theirs. So at some point we would love to be all one, because we're not really that separated, are we? So we'd very much like to hear from you if you don't feel you're represented, because we'd like to make sure that's accurate.
Yeah, because our stone, I mean, we've done Bath Abbey, we've done most of the historic part of Wales, but it does go over the border, Bristol, down south as well.
Well, of course, stone doesn't have boundaries. We create these boundaries, and that's half the issue, isn't it? So, no, that's really good to hear from you, and we'd love to hear from you, for sure.
So, I mean, it's a very interesting point, because when you look at the database, if you look at a county guide, then you need to think, well, what's that way and what's that way, because stones do move around.
Exactly.
There's a question here at the front. Go on.
Wales in there?
Why is it? I know. Yeah.
Can't hear you. My question was the same. Why isn't the Welsh quarries represented in there? I think that's a tragedy.
And we would love, as I say, we need to link up. But unfortunately, Wales doesn't have a database of stones.
I'm sorry. I don't understand. Historic England, you have responsibility for some buildings in Wales.
No.
No?
No, not really. Sorry.
Not
No.
all right.
Sorry, and now we're creating boundaries. No, we don't. That's the point. We don't. We look after England, and that's a political issue. But I completely agree with you that we should be joined up, and we would love Wales, and we would absolutely collaborate with Wales, because obviously what we have learned, what Scotland has learned about creating databases and working with the likes of the British Geological Survey, we have to work together, because there's a wealth of information. You can't do it in isolation. But it comes down to money as well. And we can't fund Wales. There'd be a willingness to work together, for sure.
Just one moment.
What about them?
Well, they're together.
Well, then that's where we could. Well, again, we need to talk to the mineral planners, and they need to talk to each other as well. So yeah, there's conversations to be had, for sure.
And then, I mean, for completeness, I know there's a very good data set for Northern Ireland.
A brilliant database for Northern Ireland. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, I know. Sorry, didn't mention that. Yeah, that's a brilliant database.
More questions? Anyone else? So when people have had a look at it, and I do encourage you to have a look, if they have got comments, is there a way they can just click them through to you?
Yes, it's my email address. Yeah, my email address is on there, so please do email me. I will respond to you. It may not be the next day or the same day, but yeah, you can contact us, and we really want to know how people are using it, and if it's not working for you. Because if it's not working, then that's not what we're here for. We're here to make it accessible for people. So we would love for you to feedback.
Your plug then for the Technical Tuesdays.
I've already done that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
extra one.
Technical Tuesdays. And if you come to stand D56, we will zap you and take your details. You'll receive our technical conservation newsletter, which will keep you updated on all things like Technical Tuesday webinars. But what I would say is all our information is free and accessible. We don't make money, as it were. We are government funded, and we want to make it as best use for everyone. So yeah, come and see us. Thank you.
Anything else for Clara? Not seeing anyone? Nope. They're all done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're very much very good to time. Our next presentation is by Ali, Davey and Jim Hart, speaking about Historic Environment Scotland's stone carbon calculator. A very different aspect, very much more to do with modern stone, though it does show the value of older stones. Ali is project manager at Historic Environment Scotland and focuses on sustainable supply of traditional materials, particularly for the heritage sector. But I know what she'll say has great interest in non-heritage sectors as well. And Jim's very much working on low carbon and sustainability for more than 20 years through universities, consultancies, and now through JH Sustainability. And he feeds his information and info back into projects. So the presentation introduces the prototype stone carbon calculator, which calculates the approximate upfront embodied carbon footprint per tonne of sandstone and granite to be used in a building project. It was funded by Zero Waste Scotland and developed in partnership with Historic Environment Scotland. I won't say any more. Hand over to Ali. Thank you.
That's brilliant. I've forgotten you were going to say all of that in the introduction. That gives me a bit more time back. Hi, everyone. I work for Historic Environment Scotland. And just before I forget, this is a pilot project. This is still a work in progress. So this is not the final version of the calculator that Jim and I will be presenting today. If you'd like to have a go at using the calculator, we'd love you to try it out. Come back to us with any feedback or comments that you have, because we will try and feed all of those into the final version as we're developing it. So you'll see on the bottom of the screen, there's a link to a web page where you can download the Excel document. Our ambition is to have this as a web-based resource, but at the moment it's just an Excel document. So you can download it from the link you see there. And don't worry, I have the link on most of the pages. So if you want to take it down, you can. There'll be other opportunities. So just in case you're not familiar with Historic Environment Scotland, we're the lead public body established to investigate, care for and promote Scotland's historic environment. So I'm going to be giving a little bit of background to the calculator before handing you over to Jim at JH Sustainability, who actually developed the calculator. So I'll just be giving you a little bit of context. So in Scotland, much of our built heritage is constructed using stone. It's very much a stone-based heritage. And when I'm talking about our heritage, it's not just the listed buildings, the castles. It's our whole built historic environment, just the unlisted properties, the towns and cities and homes that we live in. And all of the work that we're doing around stone is to support the repair and maintenance of that broader demographic of buildings. So stone is a vital resource going forward to maintain and repair all of these buildings. And it's also really important and popular material for the public sector. And we're very interested through this calculator in helping influence purchasing decisions made by the public sector more widely. As a public organisation, how we buy goods is coming under increased scrutiny. We have an obligation to embed sustainable and ethical procurement in everything that we buy. So cost can no longer be the deciding factor on the decisions that we make around our purchases. In 2016, British Geological Survey produced a report, a review of the stone industry in Scotland. Scotland has one of the most complex geologies in the world. We have over 200 building stone types, and everywhere you travel in Scotland, very often what you see built above the ground reflects what sits below your feet, the geology below your feet. In the mid-19th century, we were producing over 4 million tons of stone a year, and now it's really a fraction of that. Today, we probably import over 91% of the stone that we need in Scotland, despite having abundant resources in the country. And that has huge implications for the economy, for society, and for the environment. If you look at major projects that have been done over the last decade, there's huge losses for the economy of Scotland. And by importing stone, obviously this is a gross generalization here, but we know that there are endemic ethical issues in the stone supply internationally, widespread child labor, massive issues around migrant workers trapped in cycles of poverty, poor working conditions and health and safety. Of course, not every international stone quarry operates like this, but we know that this is a major issue. And it's something that you need to bear in mind if you're not finding out the exact source of any stone that you're purchasing. And that's what we want to change. We want to get those conversations going so that people actually have a better understanding of where their stone is coming from. So we're importing over 91% despite having an abundant supply and varied supply of stone in Scotland. So why are we not buying Scottish stone? We also know that the embodied carbon of stone is very closely linked to the distance it travels. So the carbon calculator has been developed as part of a wider suite of works that we're doing to try and promote sustainable procurement of stone. So we're working with Scotland Excel, that is the lead procurement services provider for the public sector, to create a public procurement lot. So this will be a framework of suppliers that's available to the public sector. And any supplier that signs up for that procurement lot has to evidence that they are producing stone in an ethical and sustainable way. And they will have to provide evidence for that. So that procurement lot should be available and up and running and live in December. So the calculator itself has been developed to complement the wider work that we're doing. We're also, over the next couple of years, going to be doing some economic analysis. Clara had touched through the Building Stone database the opportunities and the fact that we don't want to sterilize any stone resources that there are across the country. So we want to work with the public sector to raise awareness of that, make sure that the building stone resources for the future aren't made inaccessible through development. So it's trying to raise awareness of that there's an incredible resource there that we could make more of. So through the economic analysis work that we'll be doing over the next few years, we want to try and help support looking at where the opportunities lie. So the calculator itself has been funded by Zero Waste Scotland, and we really just want to drive change. We want to encourage specifiers to start considering the embodied carbon in the stone that they're buying. Of course, this isn't going to be the only deciding factor of the purchasing decisions that you make, but we would like it to be part of the decision-making process. And as I mentioned, this is still very much a pilot. Jim will be talking about this in more detail. It allows you to roughly calculate the embodied carbon per ton of sandstone and granite. Unfortunately, it's not available for other stone types currently. It's been designed for the Scottish market, but it is available. It can be used by anyone in the UK. And as I said, if you want to download a copy, you can download it from the web link, or you can just drop me an email, ali.davey@heads.scot, and I'd be happy to send you a link. I'll hand you over to Jim now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. I should start with a quick recap of what embodied carbon is. I'm sure most of you are pretty much aware of it by now. Firstly, I want to emphasize that embodied carbon is just one indicator amongst many of the environmental credentials of something, whether that something is a material, a product, a building, or whatever. It's a measure of the greenhouse gas emissions, primarily CO2, carbon dioxide, but other things also, associated with the extraction of materials, their transport, their processing, and manufacturing, as shown in this graphic. The emissions may predominantly be carbon dioxide, but that is associated with like fossil fuel use in the value chain, but that's not exclusively the case. There are numerous other emissions involved. Results are typically reported in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per quantity of material. We're saying kilograms of CO2 per ton of sandstone or granite. Why does embodied carbon matter? We're frequently told that it's operational energy, energy efficiency, heating and lighting, cooling, all of that stuff that matters, and that's what we've got to be driving down. Well, the whole life carbon emissions of an asset are made up of embodied carbon and operational carbon. But as we've been working on energy efficiency and low carbon energy sources, the embodied carbon is taking an increasingly large share of the pie. As you see from these examples, by the time guidance was published on the subject in a few years ago, embodied carbon was at least 2/3 of the total life cycle carbon for these assets, and yet it's operational carbon that's had all the focus. So this is all becoming much more well known, hence the growing significance of relevant environmental product declarations, EPDs, and associated international standards for the life cycle assessment of products and buildings. Accordingly, embodied carbon is starting to attract the attentions of regulators in a number of jurisdictions. And although it's still a good way behind operational carbon, but this is coming. This slide is almost obligatory in embodied carbon presentations, sadly. The scope of embodied carbon assessments can vary, that's the point. It might be limited to upfront carbon, that's the carbon already emitted when you have the new product in your hands, no crystal ball gazing required. Or it might include emissions across the full life cycle of a product, running decades into the future, including maintenance and end of life. The full life cycle is shown in this standard diagram, but in the case of the stone calculator, we're just talking about the emissions associated with the extraction and transport. So that's the bit highlighted in red there. So this is not to say that cradle to grave assessments are not needed, far from it in fact. It's just that the construction site is a clear endpoint from our perspective, looking at stone procurement, especially when we know what type of stone is required and where the stone is to be used, but we don't necessarily know how it's to be used. Zooming into that, the left-hand part of that plot on the previous slide, we see that these stages, they have these code names, these standard code names, A1, A2, A3, A4. We see that these stages are firstly quarrying, extraction of the raw material, that is, then transport to the processing site where it's sawn up and turned into product, and then finally, after that processing stage, transport to the point of use, the construction site. Within this, there are different possible perspectives. There's cradle to site, which is what the carbon calculator covers. That's all 4 stages. There's cradle to gate, which is used in many contexts where the location of the construction site isn't known. Jumping straight to the end, before going into more detail about how we get there, this is the level of information that the calculator provides. Essentially, it reports the emissions associated with each of the life cycle stages in kilograms of greenhouse gas per ton of material. And it also shows those emissions summed across the 4 stages. So that's the right-hand bar. Error bars are included on the graphs. These are intended to be indicative rather than justified by rigorous statistical analysis. They are reminders that embodied carbon is not an exact science. There is no objectively correct value when it comes to embodied carbon. It's more a question of calculating a well-documented and justified reasonable value that should be in the right ballpark. So that's true of this calculator. Really, it's true of all life cycle analysis, EPDs, etc. So where have we got the underlying data from? I'll take this in 2 parts. There's the extraction and processing of the stone on the one hand, then there's its transport on the other. So starting with the extraction and processing, that's stages A1 and A3 in the jargon. The calculator is based on analysis of quite a small number of existing research studies that have undertaken life cycle assessments of natural stone, dimensional stone, with a particular focus on embodied carbon of the quarrying and cutting stages. These include a study covering Scottish sandstone, a study from the United States, and one from Europe. As further evidence emerges and more environmental product declarations are published, the underlying data within the calculator can be revised, and we hope it will mature over time. The results for these stages A1 and A3, they depend a little bit on which country the facilities are in, but around Europe and Asia, etc., because that's associated with the energy systems operating in those countries. But the degree of variation is not actually dramatic, A1 and A3. But where the calculator really does add value is in the modeling of the transport stages. A2, quarry to the processing site, and A4, transport onto the construction site. The second of these, transport to the construction site, cannot really be represented reliably in an environmental product declaration, as the location of the construction site is generally unknown to the authors of such documents. Basic point, really. For the transport stages, emissions are calculated based on standard emission factors for each mode of transport and the distance entered by the user. So the calculator asks the user where rock is quarried, where it's sawn, where it's used, and how it is transported between these locations. The calculator is best used in contexts where comparisons are to be made between 2 stones that come from similar, different supply chains, but are otherwise very similar. So, i.e., they similar physical properties and functions. Where this is not the case, for instance, where products have differing durability or have differing requirements in terms of design and construction, straight comparisons are no longer valid. They have to be contextualized in some way to compensate for their different lifetimes or the different roles they're performing. That has to be done outside the calculator. It's something to be aware of. In cases where you have an environmental product declaration for the exact product in question, the EPD would take precedence for those stages A1 to A3, but the calculator still provides useful information about the impact of transport to the construction site. It's worth adding that whilst there are literally thousands of construction product EPDs, there really are very few published on dimensional stone. So what does using the calculator involve? Initial feedback suggests that the calculator is pretty easy to use even in its current form. It's not yet in its final form in all probability, and it should. I would expect it to get even more straightforward in due course. This is a screenshot of the data entry page of the calculator. You can see that there aren't too many fields to enter, but I'll zoom in a bit so you can see what's required. The data requirements mainly concern the three critical locations: quarry, stone yard, sawing yard, whatever, and construction site, and the distances between them. Locations are requested in order to maintain an audit trail, but the user must actually calculate the distance between these locations with road and sea distances entered separately. Online tools are suggested to help with that calculation. Here are some results for a hypothetical domestic case where the stone yard and quarry are almost co-located and the construction site is a couple of 100 kilometers away. You can see that the total emissions are up to around 100 kilograms of CO2 per ton, a little bit less. And this is mostly to do with extraction and processing, although the transport to the site does make a relevant contribution. Moving on to a hypothetical international case where the stone is provided from China, we get the sea distance in the required unit from an online tool, that's nautical miles, and the road distances are calculated from more familiar tools. And we see that the total emissions have increased 7-fold by a factor of 7, with the journey to the construction site making an overwhelming contribution. It's also possible to conceive of scenarios where both transport legs have high impacts, also leading to an even higher total. So to finish with, just a recap of a few key points and final observations. The calculator does need knowledge of your supply chain in order to produce a valid result. So this might seem like a pain, but there are so many other good reasons to find out more about how the material you're using ends up in your hands. And Ali alluded to some of that earlier. The calculator can add value even when you have an EPD for your product, because we get the additional information about the final transport stage. As mentioned before, the results will never be pinpoint accurate because of just the nature of life cycle assessment. And finally, the take-home message about embodied carbon in stone, when comparing different options, it's about the transport. Differences in results for a given stone type from different supply chains will largely be driven by differences in transport requirements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, Ali. Any questions from people? Right at the back there.
Hi. I was interested in the carbon component of the tonnage of the material. Is that based on the finished tonnage being used in the project, or does it deal with the gross tonnage, the yield that's required to produce the finished tonnage?
It's more the finished tonnage, so it's the material. It's based on the material delivered to the construction site. So the tonnage extracted from the quarry is higher.
Yes, and different stones presumably have different yields.
Yes.
So will that be something the calculator will
encompass? Yeah, I mean we've only got 2 different stone types in the calculator at the moment: granite and sandstone, and they do have different yields assumed in them. I can't remember what the numbers are.
Yeah.
Or how robust those assumptions are either.
Okay. I think from discussions, Ali, that the transport from the quarry to the processing assumes more stone goes there, and then less is transported on. I think that's correct.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it does say there will be 30, 40, 50, 60% left at the processing plant.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
One right at the front.
Yeah, you said there were 2 stones in the database at the moment, granite and sandstone. Can we look forward to some more stone types being introduced so we can
Yes.
apply it to England?
Yes, we would like to do that. Again, we're Historic Environment Scotland, but there are English stones used in Scotland as well. So we've because it's a pilot, we had to kind of keep it small, see will people use it, does it work? But the ambition is that we would expand it, certainly. Yeah.
What would you like to see?
Yeah.
Well, I just thought limestones for a start off, but obviously lias is.
Right.
Maybe some Welsh ones as well.
We'll add that to the feedback, sure.
But I think they were chosen because they're the sandstone granite are the predominant ones in your cities, and I have seen them compare sandstone from Scotland against sandstone from Northern England. Anything else from people? Again, towards the back.
Hi. You said you had 3 studies, one the UK, one the US, and one Sweden. Is that multiple EPDs per study? And if so, how many EPDs are you summing over to get your data?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
You have 3 studies, you mentioned. Yeah. Is that multiple EPDs per study?
Those weren't EPDs. Those were research studies, actually, that I mentioned. The UK and the USA and somewhere in Europe.
Sweden, you said?
Yeah.
So does your data come from those research studies?
For those stages A1 and A3, those are the predominant source of the data. We would enjoy expanding the amount of data included in the analysis.
And the Scotland one was sandstone, is that right?
Well, the Scotland studies covered, if I remember right, sandstone, granite, and slate. But not that we've touched slate in this calculator yet.
Okay. So when if I was using the tool and selecting either sandstone or granite from Scotland, that is Scottish data that is used there, not aggregating across the US and Scotland.
Actually, it's not. It's an average. I think because there are so few data points, it would just seem unreasonable to be completely specific about it in that way. To say that we've got a data point that belongs to Scotland only, and the rest of the world can share the rest.
So it relies on an assumption that the variation in carbon due to energy and processing is sufficiently low relative to transport that it's not significant enough to care about at that point, at this stage in the process, obviously.
We would, as I said, we would like to have more data. So the studies and the EPDs that we've seen suggest that those emissions are quite low compared with transport, if the transport distances are quite substantial. That's not to say there is a lack of variation in those stages A1 and A3, but we haven't got enough data to assess the standard deviation really reliably.
I think another question that came up in the feedback and in the workshops was, well, what about suppliers who have embedded renewable energy and using recycling water and all of that, and we can't, because of the stage we're at with the calculator, we can't really account for that in the calculator. But what we would say is that there needs to be another mechanism within your procurement scoring so that you might account for those in other ways through your wider scoring system.
Do you anticipate that this would be used primarily for comparing stones against each other, or stones against alternative building materials for the same application?
At the moment, stones against each other, unless Jim, you...
Yeah. I mean, we're not going to. It's very unlikely we'll include other building materials within the tool. But of course, you can take the data that you find from this calculator and compare it with data from other sources of information. It's just that, but those kind of comparisons need a lot of contextualization, taking account of different lifetimes and different functions and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I think following up on that, there were some presentations on Tuesday when I was away on EPDs, and I think in the next 3, 5, 7 years there'll be many more EPDs to draw on, partly because at a European level they look like making it mandatory for all construction products, which will suddenly encourage people. But there is some uncertainty. Even you probably saw in the small print at the bottom, EN 15804. Even if you follow that, you can still get different answers depending on the assumptions you made. If it's very difficult if somebody says I'm a zero carbon processor, so if I went to northern France, a lot would claim zero carbon because they're nuclear powered. So I swap one impact for another one. It's and we've got a few years down the line to get some of those evened out. Any more questions? I'm sure you're around for a bit longer over lunchtime.
Yep,
I think
sticking around
to answer questions. But it's a really good. It's a very much a start. And the more feedback, like with Clara's database, the more feedback we can put in, more information, the more you can refine it. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
So we come to our third and final speaker in this session, kind of moving slightly more to the practicalities of actually getting hold of some of these stones, whether they're from the database or low carbon ones. I'd like to welcome Andy King from Geckoella Ltd. And he can tell you why it's called that. He worked for a long while with English Nature and Natural England, leading a team looking at identification and conservation of geological and geomorphological sites. Then has been Principal Geologist and Director with Geckoella Ltd, and now specialises in identifying and sourcing building stones, working a lot with the database and with Historic England. So he's very much going to talk about the challenges of obtaining stones, small quarries or quarries which are closed, and giving us a couple of case studies to look at that. Andy, thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the things I should also say straight from the outset is that I'm a Welshman, born in Caerphilly. Okay, so here you have a Welshman working on English building stones. There we are. Good morning, nice to see you all. So I've got a bit of an impossible task really in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, but we've been working on formerly the Strategic Stone Study and now BSDE since 2011. So we've been doing this for quite a bit of time. So really quite a difficult task in the next 20 minutes or so. But what I wanted to do is to take you through a couple of case studies in particular, just to give you an idea and a flavour of the kind of challenges that we found as geological consultants with sourcing the stones. Identification, not too much of a problem in some cases. But of course, we've got the challenge that a lot of the former historical quarries have long since gone. Often quite unique stones are being exploited from there. The quarries have either gone through development, sterilization, etc., or through lack of management, lack of use. So fallen into disrepair, and accessibility is now very difficult. So what we found in terms of identifying the stones and then trying to find the sources is we often get a series of common questions that kind of arise. And one of the challenges is if we can't find the original stone, if it no longer is extractable in terms of practicality or viability, is what's the sort of next best similar stone that the client thinks is going to be suitable. All right, and it's challenges sort of around that. So a couple of worked examples will hopefully illustrate that. But before we get into the sorting, then of course one of the main tasks for us is for the identification of the building stones themselves. No rocket science really involved in this. We've got a whole series of tools, as it were, in the ID box that we can use, all the way from the very simple hand specimen identification. We might be using polished sections, etc., for that. One of the things that we particularly like to do in Geckoella, and this is very relevant for carbonates, so for limestones, is using the stained acetate peel technique. We're actually cutting the rock, polishing it, and then actually producing for like a film of the rock surface. It's not as good as a thin section. I won't pretend that it is, but we often can use it in terms of corroborating what we think the stone is, and it's a cheap and effective way of actually doing that for a client. But the mainstay, to be honest, of the sort of examination work that we do for ID purposes is done with petrographical thin sections. Okay, either looking at them in plain polarized light or crossed polarized light. You can see in the central upper picture there, that's a very attractive thin section in cross polars of a clinopyroxene gabbro, an igneous rock, and that's from Scotland, just to make it extra wide for us. The other part of the analysis, of course, that's very important in terms of building stones for clients is the actual physical tests. And what are you going to be using the stone for? So the typical tests that can be undertaken, particularly by BRE, for example, as well, with Tim and his team, density and porosity, saturation coefficients, how's the stone going to respond when it's wet, the absorption, and critically, of course, we find the compressive strength. So if you're looking for a stone which actually is going to require durability, it's going to be used in a structural way, a particular way in a building, then obviously compressive strength tests are critical to it. Okay, so we have a whole armory of techniques that we can use for ID and for testing the physical characteristics of building stones. So here's a couple of case examples. This one is from a home patch. We're based down in Somerset, all right? So this is a very local for me. I'll try not to go into too much geologies, okay? Geologists are very bad at doing that. So if I see blank faces, then I'll put it back into English, right? Don't worry. But on the right-hand side of the map there, that bright sort of postbox red area, and further south of it, that's the Quantock Hills. Those are Devonian age sediments. On the left-hand side nearest to me, then that's Exmoor National Park and the Brendon Hills. And the area to look at is that, what we call the Vale of Taunton Dean. It's that area in the middle, shown by the orange and the yellow rocks. And those are Permo-Triassic sandstones. Various different formations, but they're really an attractive building stone. It's quite widely used, not just in Somerset, but a bit wider around. They vary from kind of like a foxy red, orange sandstone through to a very deep red-brown, almost terracotta kind of sandstone. But they're widely used and pretty durable. We refer to these as the otter sandstones, ones we're going to talk about now. They have a new name, the Helsby Sandstone Formation. We try to use, to be honest, some of the older terms when we can. So here's a few examples of their use. This is the old Victorian police station in Willetton. It's currently just undergoing some restoration work and redevelopment work into a whole series of apartments and flats. But it uses local otter sandstone from Willetton Quarry, which no longer exists. And there's also dressings of Bath stone and another local stone in Somerset, Bolting stone, type of inferior oolite limestone. Several kilometres away in another village called Bishop's Lydiard, then the otter sandstone there is quite a different colour. It's this sort of more deep red-brown colour. And this is one of the points I wanted to raise, is that although we may be dealing with a particular stone name type, otter sandstone, then one of the things we find quite commonly is that as you move along the outcrop of that stone, is that it changes colour. And of course, from a client's point of view, there's no point in having the Bishop's Lydiard type of otter sandstone if you've got restoration work to do further up at Willetton. It's going to stand out like a sore thumb. But these are the very attractive almshouses, and this is part of the conservation area within in the village of Bishop's Lydiard. So here's a screen grab from the Building Stones database. I've elaborated a little bit more. It's a composite, but you can see the mustard yellow colour there, which I've circled in red around Bishop's Lydiard, the village where the almshouses are. And if you right-click when you go onto the database, then it'll actually bring up more geological information, and you can link that through to the various formation, the stone type, etc. Okay. So what we're dealing with here is the Otter Sandstone, the Hemsby Formation in the modern terminology, and looking at the source in Bishop's Lydiard. And there was only one source. It's quite clearly this was the source for the stone. That's the site of the original and the only quarry. It's right in the grounds of Lydiard Manor, which is a very imposing building. The rest of the sort of high street, as it were, the church and all the other buildings, that's where the almshouses are located. They're all built of the same stone. They're in desperate need of restoration work now. But of course, in terms of practicalities, there's really no way that we can open up or look at reopening up this particular quarry for this particular type of Lydiard stone, as it's called. One thing, it's almost inaccessible, highly overgrown. That picture is from the BGS memoir, and that was printed in 1985. The photograph may predate that a bit. So that's 40 years ago. And even then, there's only a couple of meters of exposed. So, you know, it's in a pretty dilapidated state now. So the real practical kind of considerations about, right, the quarries no longer really are existing. So in terms of trying to reopen that, then, to be honest, it's a bit of a no-goer. We're right on the edge of the Quantock Hills AONB in any case. And often we find there's a lot of environmental or wildlife or conservation designations put on old quarries. Old quarries attract a lot of wildlife. And so, you know, they get designated for other reasons. And also, of course, as you can see, accessibility for even a small scale quarry there is going to be tough going. So to all intensive purposes, there are no Otter sandstone quarries available for this red sandstone anywhere in Somerset or this part of southwest England. Which gives us a bit of a dilemma, because if you're looking for a like for like, then it would be nice to be able to try to find an Otter sandstone quarry. It doesn't exist, unless you're going to open a new quarry, which I'll mention a bit later on. However, in this case, there is further north, Captain Quarry, which is working. It's the only working red sandstone quarry in Somerset, as far as I'm aware. It's small scale, so you can see the figures there, etc. It's only working 1,500 tons per annum, and it's got planning permission now through for another several years. The thing is, though, it's not in the Otter Sandstone Formation. It's in a different formation. It's actually in what's called the Chester Formation, which is north conglomerates. So we've got an unusual geological kind of anomaly here, which we're exploiting in the fact that we've got a sandstone lens. It happens to be the same color. It happens to have very, very similar characteristics to Otter Sandstone. So therefore, we're going to use this one. It's the next best thing for all practical purposes, and we've done the various tests on it, etc. And it's a very handy, useful little quarry, not just for restoration of older buildings or vernacular buildings, but also they're doing pretty decent trade in terms of new build development as well. And it's not a huge resource, so it's managed, you know, pretty carefully. But you can see in some of the new developments that it's used primarily just as a facing stone, which in terms of the planning legislation has been deemed to be acceptable. That's enough. Okay. So I think the message for that is we got to be pretty flexible as geologists in terms of looking around for what is the next best or the next most suitable stone. Yeah? Got to be realistic about this. Second case example is Tottenham stone, and this might be one that some of you have heard of or are familiar with. Very widely used in several counties, particularly Beds, Bucks, Herts, and Cambridgeshire. A very long history. It's used since Roman times, but extensively used in Norman times for internal work. I put a font in there particularly for Clara, because I know she likes these fonts. Okay, but also for some really impressive stonework in very large ecclesiastical buildings, and also in some ceiling vaults, etc. as well. The issue is that it's an exceptionally limited resource at the moment, and the future of that resource is very uncertain. Yet there's a lot of restoration work which is required to be done. The other aspect about Tottenham stone as well is it's one of those chalk stones that when you extract it, you actually have to let it dry, let it harden for up to a couple of years usually before you can start to really use it and cut it and work it properly. And also the wastage with it is extraordinary. Typically, we're finding in talking with the various company is that 30 to 40%, sometimes as much as 70% is wastage, depending on the particular type of Tottenham stone that you're dealing with. And that brings us into another issue that we often find is when people call things by a stone name, is it actually that particular stone name, or does it mean something else? So when we started looking at Tottenham stone, then we quite quickly found there were several stones types that were named Tottenham stone, which were all from Tottenham stone quarry, the type quarry as it were, but from different levels within that quarry, and they were quite characteristically different stones. So one of the tasks we had to do for a client was to identify another chalk, which, as this is a live case, I'm just referring to it as chalk X for the moment, okay? But it's not from Bedfordshire. And do analysis of that chalk to compare it with Tottenham to see if there was sufficient similarity, sufficient properties, etc., because the available resource of Tottenham was so limited, it wouldn't be sufficient for the task in hand. So going through the analysis, then the hand specimen comparison. So Tottenham Clunch, which is from Tottenham Quarry, that's quite a coarse, gritty chalk. From elsewhere within the quarry, same quarry, was a stone named Tottenham Hard Chalk. That's a much finer, more even-grained, homogeneous kind of chalk. And then looking at chalk X, then we actually found that just on a visual inspection, it was more akin to Tottenham Hard Chalk. The colour range there perhaps is a bit misleading in there. These chalks actually vary from pale grey to a pale cream colour anyway. So there's a good range of hues in all of this. But one of the aspects we saw straight away about chalk X was that it contained these very, very fine stringers, these very fine solution lamini, which actually a clay filled, sorry, and that's got significant implications when it comes to actually how we could use that chalk if it passed the other tests anyway. So on a visual inspection, yeah, there was some hope to go on for more detailed analysis. And so we started with a petrographic analysis then. So with the Tottenham Clunch, top left there, you can see, yeah, this is the gritty chalk. The constituents in there are more coarsely grained. Compare that with a much finer texture and constituents within Tottenham Hard Chalk. And then if you look at and sort of in your mind do the scale bar analysis, then you'll see that chalk X actually is fine-grained, similar to the Tottenham Hard Chalk. And also when we look at the constituents, then there's enough similarity there as well, again, between chalk X and Tottenham Hard Chalk. So it was looking promising. And then the crunch, of course, was with the physical test comparisons as well. And without going into too much detail, then we actually could see there was a good range, there was a good comparator between these different chalks, and that on a whole, chalk X kind of fared pretty well. It compared quite well with the other two other chalks from Tottenham, and particularly its compressive strength was actually for a chalk really quite impressive. And because it was going to be used in a structural way for for some vaulting, then of course compressive strength was really important for this particular stone type. So overall, Chalk X was kind of like stacking up really well. The kind of sting in the tail with it was it did have these slight stringers, very, very thin stringers running through it. They were chalk filled, so if they would get wet, of course, then there was a chance of that clay, those clay layers actually expanding, which would lead potentially to the rock itself spalling. So the kind of the significant caveat with using this stone type was internal work really only. Okay. So even in the cases where we do find a reasonably good similarity or a very good comparator rock, then there often are caveats attached to it. It tends to be a bit on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so two other elements. Reopening of quarries. Well, this isn't easy. You don't need me to tell you that, really. There are, of course, a lot of challenges to overcome with original quarries. There's a balance between, is it easier to open up a former quarry, a historical quarry, or a heritage quarry, as opposed to trying to open up a new quarry in the appropriate stone at a different location. As I mentioned, there are a lot of environmental labels on a lot of areas now as well. And there are, of course, significant issues around pressure groups who don't want quarries opened up locally, but are in a bit of a dichotomy whereby no quarry, but actually they do appreciate the local vernacular architecture. So they do want the stone to restore it, but of course not stone from their own local area, which is where you want the local stone from. So yeah, there's difficulties. We have to be diplomats as well as geologists with some of this also. But two case examples, one we were involved with quite closely, which was Bennefield Quarry, and this was looking at Oundle stone in East Northants, a former building stone quarry which had supplied Oundle, hadn't been worked for 80 years or so, still some exposure there, a very active pressure group who were anti the quarry. And the planners involved in this came back to us with a challenge about could we demonstrate a proven need for that particular stone and a proven need for that particular stone from that locality, because historically there'd been lots of other quarries in the area which supplied this particular type of Blisworth limestone, the Oundle stone. So using some of the data that we actually were putting together at the time for the building stone database, we're able to compile a heritage report, basically, which was an analysis of how Oundle stone had been used in Oundle, which was the main recipient for this, where restoration work was being required. And there had been, to be honest, some shocking examples where other substitute stones have been used, even Portland stone and that's not knocking Portland stone, I love it, but it was really inappropriate to use it in this context. So we actually did quite a significant analysis on the use of Oundle stone to demonstrate the need for it. And then also as well, there was the issue around, well, what about the existing quarries? Well, there were no existing quarries apart from Bennefield, because the existing quarries were either under a National Nature Reserve designation now, or they were part of Oundle Golf Club, which is very prestigious, I can assure you, and would not want quarries in the vicinity, or they were part of a significant boating lake as well. So basically we're able to say it's this quarry in terms of a historical quarry to reopen, or you open up a new quarry, or it's game over kind of thing, really. And that was actually quite a powerful argument, and so that was used in the planning decision, and alongside a comparison with planning guidance and the use of Section 106 agreements, then it won through. And you can see there, then the permission has been there for, quite a significant quarry over significant numbers of years. So the supply of Oundle stone, at least, looks to be okay for a while. The other example, which we haven't been so involved with, but I've put that on because it's local to us, just over the border in Devon. And this is the very recent reopening of a small quarry in one of the igneous suites of rocks there. The volcanic series. It's actually a lamprifier in geological terms, but it's a very attractive sort of deep red, almost like a serpentine kind of rock. Hasn't been worked for a long time, but restoration work was really required in Exeter in terms of the castle, in terms of the cathedral. It's also being used now in the National Trust's Killerton Chapel. So a real need for it. And it was a small quarry which has just been reopened by a farmer who owned the land, was very and is very cognizant of the need for local stone, etc. So quite an unusual sort of occurrence, but won through. And so we now have a supply of the Exeter volcanic stone as well. So, you know, there are opportunities out there, but it's challenging. It's not easy. They're quite few and far between. And they do require, you know, quite a bit of considered thought and tactical approach, I'm saying. And then finally, this is very much sort of work in progress. And of course, one of the challenges that we're faced with in terms of restoration and conservation is always the challenge to replace like with like as close as you can. And we've actually found that one of the ways that we can kind of like get our heads around some of this is to actually adopt a hierarchy. And I'm a bit of a nerd for hierarchies and decision trees and stuff like that. I kind of feel quite reassured about them. I like using them. This is one that we're developing and modifying a bit more in Geckoella, but you can see the sort of the upper apex of the triangle there is around the ideal scenario, which is you've got the availability of the same stone in the same location. Well, that doesn't happen very often, I can assure you. So the next kind of tier of the triangle is, well, you've got the same stone, but it's in a slightly different location. Yeah? And then as you move further down the triangle, it gets more complicated, because then, of course, you're making a measured judgment between, well, we've got suitably similar stone, which is in a working quarry where we've got some resource available, or do we balance that up against an even more similar stone, but that's in a non-working quarry? You know, now where does the balance come in for that? And of course, there are other elements to build into that equation as well. There's the cost benefits for it. There's now, hopefully, you know, the sustainability and the carbon element as well to consider in all of it as well. So very much work in progress, but I think a hierarchical kind of approach to this is certainly one of the ways that we're interested in developing further. I've got some geological colleagues in Geckoella who are far greater mathematicians than I am, and they're sure that you can actually start to produce some very complex looking formula where you can put all the different factors in and then come up with a magic score. And then that will be, you know, the way to present to clients or Historic England about saying, well, this score's a factor of 3.2, so, you know, it's better than 3. We shall see. But very much work in progress, that one. Anyway, a whistle-stop tour, but I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Questions? We have 2 or 3 minutes left for questions. One just outside.
Hello, thank you for the amazing talk. Found it really interesting. Just for a bit of background, my previous work is looking at the impact of clay minerals on the durability of stones, and I just wondered if you had any case studies in particular, because I know you mentioned with the chalk and layers of clay which can potentially expand and contract. So have you ever measured some of the physical properties like hydric expansion? Or one thing I was really interested in my research was the differences in compressive strength when rock is, say, saturated versus when it's dry. So yeah, I just wanted to hear from your sort of vast experience if there's any case studies involving clay minerals where, you know, it's had a massive impact on sort of the durability of the stone.
Right, thank you. I like the easy questions first. The answer to that simply is no, not to that level of detail. Okay, what we were more interested in was with the sort of standard compressive strength testing was whether or not there was the risk of a failure within that chalk X. Okay, apart from these anastomosing, and they are really fine. You're talking about diameters of 0.1 to 0.5 of a millimeter, but they are packed with clay minerals, and they are quite common, and they're irregular. So it's not easy to actually be able to say, well, as far as we know, there's one particular part of the quarry, one particular bed, where these clay veins are concentrated. So we'll avoid that, and we'll take the comparable chalk from next door. They seem to be permeating irregularly through it. So I think it's a characteristic really of the rock. Okay. What we did see from both samples that we collected and also samples provided was that there was an almost 100% relationship between the spalling of the rock and the flaking of the chalk along these surface planes, the anastomosing planes. But as to what particular type of clay it was, then no, we didn't go into that level of detail, partly because we got the answer really we wanted straight away from a physical strength characteristic. Yeah, it was a challenge for that one. Okay, so sorry I can't give you the particular clay mineralogy of it, but I give you the specimens. You're welcome to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you. One right at the back there.
Yeah, are we working? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've been involved in two projects similar to what you've been speaking about. One was in for Battersea Clinton, where we took out the Arden sandstone within the property for.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Two projects. I think everything you've said is correct. Two projects that I've been involved with. One was extracting Battersea Clinton for Battersea Clinton the Arden sandstone.
Right.
Again, needed conservation, needed all the councils and conservation architects involved, and that was good. And another one in the middle of Warwick, where we actually found a golf course which had been used as a shooting range at some point, and not for shooting people, but for target practice. And we
right.
stone out for doing that. However, where I think there's something which should be looked at, and it's so frustrating, is that we've just had now, you've been talking about chalk, and you've been talking about the deposits, and then if you then link it back to where your carbon indexing is all associated with, we've missed a huge opportunity with HS2 going through, because some of the deposits of stone along that railway track are the same stones in the local area.
Yeah.
And the actual cost when you start equating into your carbon indexing, you're actually part of another scheme. So overall, there's so many boxes need to be ticking. I remember going into Chester, and the old red sandstone for Chester, they were putting a car park underneath what was going to be a hotel. And I remember going there and saying, oh, look at the sandstone. You can see the original mason marks. Can we have this? Yes, if you get it out tomorrow. So all of this is great, but it somehow needs to have the civil engineering companies, it needs to have the builders, and it needs to have something whereby somebody links it all together, so that there is a responsibility for those that are building, which will give us more time, and we can access these stones, and we can make it work for everybody.
Yeah. I share your frustration to a large degree about that, and have some similar experiences where you see the opportunities for stone extraction and stone storage, shall we say, to be utilized. It isn't done as far as I know, partly because I think of the cost. I'm surmising, but the cost of actually storing, and I think there isn't enough joined up really thinking about let's have this resource of a Cheshire red sandstone, for example, or whatever. When we do get these large engineering projects where we can actually utilize it and forward think. But as far as I know, and I'm very happy to be corrected about this, there isn't a company at the moment that kind of promotes that or promotes the storage of stone in that way, in that quantity, when these opportunities arise. And as a result of it, particularly with Tottenham stone, for example, then the availability of the Tottenham stone at the moment is in a matter of a few tens of tons, probably. That's all that's outside of the quarry. And the future of the quarry itself is very uncertain. And geographically, the areas around it are quite highly labelled, shall we say, with various designations, which comes back to exactly to your point that where there are these engineering opportunities is why don't we maximise the use of them? And I'm very conscious of a little project near us called Hinkley, Hinkley Point C, where a lot of limestone was taken out, Lias limestone, and the vast majority of that was crushed. Okay, we were allowed rescue digs to go in and take out some of the nice fossils, and they're now in the museum, but nevertheless there was an awful lot of material that was crushed there. Yeah.
Going to draw us to a close now. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you very much.
That's the end of our session for now. Start again at 12, looking more towards climate change and its links to stone. So hope to see some of you then. But let's thank all of our speakers.